Good morning, everyone. My name is George Sarrinikolaou. I'm a senior manager at the Earth Institute at Columbia University. I'd like to welcome you to the Sustainability Space Professional Development Lecture Series. This is a series of virtual events that are meant to expose students and alumni to leading practitioners in the field. Our guest practitioner today is Stephanie Smith, who serves as an assistant director in the Baltimore City Department of Planning. She serves as the agency's equity officer and oversees the work of the sustainability, policy and data analysis, and food policy divisions. She's a former congressional staffer and advocate for Earthjustice, and her experience involves a wide array of environmental, public health, community development, and social justice policy issues. Stephanie has a bachelor's degree from Hampton University, a master's from the University of Delaware, and a JD from Howard University School of Law. She's also a member of the Maryland Bar. Stephanie Smith, good morning and welcome.
Good morning. So great to see you and honored to be here today.
So we are eager to learn from you about Baltimore, about equity in Baltimore, and how equity connects or is affected by or links to the environment, to sustainability more broadly. So I'll turn it over to you. You'll speak for about 20 or so minutes, 30 minutes, and then we'll take lots of questions from our audience.
Okay, great. I'm just going to prepare to share my screen. Okay, great. So again, I'm very happy to be here speaking not only with current students, but also alumni. And I want to just go over briefly some of the discussion points I want to hit upon. That way you know where we're going and where we're trying to take the conversation. And of course, I'm really eager to get your questions after the conclusion of my remarks. So I think before we talk about how we're addressing issues of equity, we really need to talk about where we're coming from. So I want to just give a few highlights of some historical touch points that have really kind of embedded the roots of inequity in the city of Baltimore, and how some of those policies were also exported nationwide and sometimes internationally. Also discuss how principles of sustainability are driving equitable policy efforts within the city of Baltimore. And then also, how does COVID-19 impact existing inequities, and what could be the opportunities posed by the challenging time we find ourselves in, and in terms of addressing some longstanding challenges. And then lastly, I look forward to questions from all of you. So Baltimore was really at the vanguard, unfortunately, of advancing policies around racial segregation. I often share this picture when I, discuss this legacy, this very tortured legacy. This is in fact a picture of the New York Times on Christmas Day in 1910. And as you can see from the headline, Baltimore tries drastic plan of race segregation, and it notes that the strange situation led the Oriole City to adopt the most pronounced Jim Crow measure on record. And I think oftentimes when we think of the legacy of Jim Crow and racially discriminatory laws, we tend to think about the deeper South. But in this regard, Baltimore was advancing a notion that people of different races should not be living together. And this was really initiated by the fact that a Black lawyer moved into a rather Tony section of town and rented out his home. And that created an uproar in the community. And it was actually something that they found sympathetic ears within City Hall to put forth this particular law. Now, we know that many of the things I'm going to highlight here were found to be unconstitutional, but it shows kind of an orientation towards separating community members by race in a very explicit fashion. And there are other states that look to this particular law for inspiration. And unfortunately, others even across the world looked for inspiration. So this map, these two maps, I think, are really kind of instructive of how past policies, though they've been struck down because they're unconstitutional and illegal, they still have the ability to pretty much affect the future or the present that we're in, because even when you take laws off the books that are unjust, there's still a muscle memory and a policy, a practice of policy around so many stakeholders that still can yield inequities, even if folks are not explicitly setting forth or wanting to go about doing their work in an equitable way. So the picture to the left there is the residential security map of 1937. Often these maps, most cities had maps that looked like this. They are now known as redlining maps. So as you can see, the pinkish salmon, the red colored areas were the areas where it was really discouraged for lenders to extend mortgages to folks that wanted to own homes. And yellow lined were a bit better positioned, but still not as desirable as ultimately the green and blue lined areas that you see to the north and to the center of the city. So when you see this map and you see the red areas, there was a professor formerly of Morgan State, Dr. Lawrence Brown, who coined the phrase the black butterfly. So those areas have high concentrations of Black residents, and they almost look like butterfly wings. And then when you look at the center, the spine of the city, kind of from Johns Hopkins to the north going downtown, and then when you go slightly to your bottom right there, he termed that the white L, where it's a stronger population of largely affluent white residents, and then they have this butterfly effect of the legacy redlined communities. So when you look to the map to the right, this is a map that's produced by our Food Policy Initiative, which is a division of the Department of Planning in conjunction with many other partners, including Johns Hopkins, where we created a food system map where we look at where there's access to healthy food, where people are able to get to healthy food, and where they're not able to get to healthy food. And when you look at the areas in the red, they have been termed the healthy food priority areas. I think many folks are more familiar with the phrase food deserts. It's essentially those same areas. So you can see there's some consistency between those areas that have had ongoing challenges around access to healthy food and the legacy of redlining. So these are the types of inequities we're trying to address in the present, despite a tortured history in the past. So as an agency, we developed an equity statement that really was something we came up with together collaboratively. We looked at the equity statements of other cities for inspiration, and we came up with this definition, and I won't read it all to you, but I think what's really important about it is that our team was really intent upon making sure that the meaningful engagement of residents was inclusive, collaborative, and ultimately tied them to access to power and resources. Oftentimes when we're talking about engaging community members, and particularly those in communities that have historically been underserved, I think we often kind of tap out at informing a community about something, not necessarily expanding their own access to resources and powers independent of their involvement with the anchor institution or the government agency. So for us, we felt that in many ways, because there's limitations to our own staffing capabilities, there's limitations to our own ability to really be on the ground and present in the way that we would most desire, mostly because there's challenges around staffing, that the more we can actually equip our community members to navigate the land use, development, and related systems in a more productive way, it actually enables us to be a more suitable and productive partner with communities, particularly historically underserved communities. So, we are a city that has an Office of Sustainability, one of the first major cities to have a sustainability director. And as such, we are a member of the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, also termed USDN. And through our membership with USDN, we were exposed to the equity lens that they developed, and we have adopted that as an agency, not just within the context of the work of our sustainability office, but actually within the context of our entire agency's work. And it's a four-part lens that I think is very accessible, particularly to professionals who may be new to concerns around equity and how it relates to their work. And the four-part lens looks at structural, procedural, distributional, and transgenerational equity concerns. And I think that for many professionals, it can be very overwhelming when you've inherited a legacy of redlining, when you've inherited a legacy of blockbusting. And some of those policies I showed you were sowed in Baltimore. You can sometimes feel overwhelmed by what can you do to unplan or peel away at some of those structural pieces. And we, through our engagement with the community and different planning efforts and sustainability planning efforts, we keep asking ourselves, what are the historic advantages or disadvantages that have affected residents in this given community or in this given context in which we operate? And I think that that self-inquiry, that agency level inquiry is really important, because we can often have blind spots because we're on a version of autopilot in many ways doing our work. But I want to really focus on procedural equity, because I think in many ways people presume that maybe a law needs to happen or something needs to be actualized at a very high level of leadership in order for a more equitable outcome to be achieved. But when I came to this job, I've been with the office, the planning agency for a little over 3 years now. I was thinking that I would be looking at policies and procedures and figuring out how they could become more equitable. And what I realized is that in many ways, inequity thrives in ambiguity. The more opaque the system, it's actually easier for inequitable realities to really not only be fostered, but sustained. So what I realized is that we actually need to create more procedure, more on-ramps that were transparent, so that the public could know how to better interact with us. And I think that depending on where you are in your professional career, you may find yourself in a similar situation. For example, something as simple as, why are we having this meeting on this day at this time, could really be a procedure fully within the control of staff, but because of custom, maybe they haven't realized that the date, the time, and the manner in which certain meetings are being held were actually creating an exclusionary environment or really a prohibitive environment for people to interact. So I want to just really focus on participants today thinking about, what are the procedures, what are some of the norms, what are some of the things that you do in an organization you're in or in a job setting that you believe could be prohibiting others from maybe more meaningfully engaging with your work. Distributional inequity is something that really looks at the distribution of power and resources within any given context or set of geography. And because Baltimore has obviously established and sustained a high level of racial residential segregation, in many ways, geographic distribution of opportunity can be a proxy for racial distribution of opportunity. That is not always the same in every city, but particularly in many of our legacy cities and cities in the Northeast and Midwest, there is a bit of durability to that reality. And then lastly, transgenerational inequity. I think we often do not think about the undue burdens we're placing on future generations. And it's sometimes set up in just how we are planning and developing solutions. I know, for example, when you think about land use and environmental solutions, whether it's addressing legacies of brownfields, if it's addressing issues related to a landfill, for example. In our city, we have a landfill that's nearing capacity. We're thinking about how can we, remove more organic waste from the waste stream, foster more composting, so that we're not necessarily investing in a bigger landfill. Maybe we could be using our capital dollars in a more strategic way for more longstanding and sustainably managed processes for waste. But if we're sometimes not thinking about who's that next taxpayer for the next 20 and 30 years when we're binding, you know, their kind of hands when we're making certain sets of decisions. I think we're not thinking about that 15-year-old, that 20, sometimes not even that 25-year-old who's going to be the person who's going to be on the line, making sure that we're able to afford some of these updates that we're making. So as I mentioned, we have an equity lens that we deploy from USDN, but we also have an equity and planning committee. And that committee was staff initiated. It was not initiated by a director or by a mayor. It was initiated by staff. And the reason why I think that's really important, particularly as I participate in a professional development series, is that oftentimes I think we don't realize the opportunities we have to lead right from the place we are in our career. We sometimes think we have to wait to get to a certain job title or to a certain level of leadership to exercise certain forms of leadership, but that's not necessarily true. If you can manage up and convince leadership that something that they're currently not doing should be revisited in a different way, and you can show how you're willing to add value by helping the organization think about some things in a different way, I think you might be surprised what momentum you might be able to achieve. So our rank and file staff established an equity and planning committee. They came up with 5 points that they really wanted to focus on. And then they recommended to the prior director that someone be hired at a senior level to operationalize and to really lead the implementation of the action plan. So I'm in one of those rare positions that I really owe my colleagues the opportunity to serve in this capacity at the Department of Planning, because if not for their foresight and initiative, I may not be before you even speaking today. So I just wanted to just quickly highlight that we want to focus on increasing our relationships with communities that have been historically underserved. We also want to make sure that our own staff demographics continue to work to reflect the racial demographics of our city. We also were, in fact, because of our efforts, we were a model for some efforts legislatively in City Council to create an equity assessment law across the city. So not only were the efforts of staff to increase kind of not only dialogue, but action around equity within our agency, serving to further the impact of our work, it also created an opportunity to get all of our agencies on board through legislation and requiring all of our sister agencies to think about equity in a very specific way and with particular benchmarks. And then also we want to figure out, because we're in an unusual role as a Department of Planning that under the city charter actually prepares the capital budget for the city of Baltimore, we want to figure out how we can more strategically utilize an equity lens to prioritize those capital investments. And then I think, you know, a theme you'll keep hearing from me is that you have to continuously evaluate your own policies and procedures, because there's never going to be a day where you're like, you know what, it's all equitable. It's really an approach, it's a lifestyle, it's a seeking out to ensure that you're always thinking about things in the most robust and equitable fashion. So I want to talk about some of our programs, some of our efforts and initiatives that really are thinking about equity. I want to first start with some of our programs that are focusing on, quite frankly, the legacy of inequity that we're living in. It was not built in a day. It was fostered, nurtured, and has existed over several generations. So we find ourselves in a moment where there are parts of our city that have more tree canopy cover than others. We have parts of our city that are more prone to flooding than others. And because the threats of climate change are only going to exacerbate some of these issues related to heat islands, related to flooding, and challenges for communities that are sometimes also dealing with high rates of unemployment, vacant lands and vacant homes, and also high rates of crime. We wanted to figure out how in the short term we can meet the needs of these communities that in many ways have some challenges around social and political capital, but they're most vulnerable to some of the most adverse effects of climate. climate change. So our sustainability office developed a resiliency hub model because there are some members of our communities that are not necessarily excited about interfacing with the government or other seemingly very official stakeholders to get help and assistance in their times of challenge. And COVID-19 has been another layer on top of communities that were often very challenged. So we found community outposts that were already known to some of these vulnerable communities, and they were places where people felt most comfortable seeking aid and resources. So we have been staffing and supporting with resources active resiliency hubs across Baltimore. And this has been a headquarters, so to speak, of activity around addressing issues of food and security. How can we recover food from restaurants that were, not experiencing a great deal of business? How can we also, people are home now more than ever before. There's been an increase in waste, quite frankly, because of that. How can we also direct some of that waste out of the waste stream and into composting and other more sustainable waste management practices? And then also, these are places where people know if their electricity goes out, they can maybe get their cell phones charged. There's access to generators. There's access to resources. So even though COVID-19 is a very express emergency for our country and an emergency management prompt, we really have thought about these hubs in the context of multi-hazards, because quite frankly, in 2015, when we experienced the social unrest tied to the death of Freddie Gray, who had been in police custody at the time of his injury, the same needs that were posed during that time of unrest, 5 years later, people are looking at their Facebook memories and seeing the same needs for food, the same needs for resources for young people. So we are really trying to figure out how we can expand this model over the next several years, because we want people to get the help they need. And when you consider that we are a city where roughly a third of households do not have regular access to a vehicle, and we do not have the most optimal public transit, the fact that these are places people can get to on foot and in their community footprint, is going to be critical to making sure that they have not just access to resources, like very tangible things like food, but also access to information from a messenger that they trust. And I think in a time that we're finding ourselves in, where people are sometimes very skeptical of many public health messages and other messages from what were formerly trusted voices, we really want to make sure that we're getting people accurate information from the messengers that they trust. And our Resiliency Hub model gives us that opportunity. As I mentioned, we also have a food policy initiative. And, just as I showed you a few slides ago, there are some parts of our city that really have challenges around access to healthy food. And the reason why we've kind of drifted from the phrase food deserts to healthy food priority areas, even though we know that's a bit wonky, is that there wasn't necessarily an absence of food in these communities. There's an absence of healthy food. There is a pretty comprehensive system of corner stores across Baltimore City, upwards of 600 plus corner stores. And they were never designed to really provide the fresh food amenities and the diversity of food that a full grocery retail establishment could provide. But in many ways, they were sometimes the only place that people could access food. So we launched the Resident Food Equity Advisors effort a few years ago, because we realized that one, people want better, healthier and affordable food in their communities. And after doing a series of surveys with not only our team, but our colleagues at Johns Hopkins, it was really intriguing to see how proximity was not even the biggest driver for people in terms of gaining food. They wanted to have quality, and if that meant they had to get a ride with a friend or even sometimes utilize an Uber, people were really taking extraordinary efforts to make sure that they could get the best food possible for their family members to the extent they had the ability. So we wanted to make sure that we not only got the perspective of residents as it pertains to their access to food and to healthy food specifically, we also wanted to develop messengers in community that, again, are trusted messengers that know the landscape of their communities, but could also serve as a policy voice to not only city council members, but also elected members of the state delegation. So what's really great about this program is it began initially as just explaining the food landscape to residents who are concerned around food issues. But then they started to realize we want to target our solutions around policy topics that we can really wrap our arms around and that we can really make an impact around. So many people realize we want to bring in healthy retail, but how can we also make the retail we already have healthier? So this cohort of residents have been working for a couple of years now around specific food policy recommendations that they deliver to the mayor, that they deliver to their respective council members around ways we could have maybe staple food, a staple food ordinance, not unlike a similar ordinance in Minneapolis, Minnesota, that requires certain staple foods to be provided within the context of convenience/corner stores. These are items that do not take up a lot of counter space and do not necessarily overtax refrigeration capabilities for these stores that are often quite small, but they also give some baseline healthier food options for folks that may be challenged by transportation and income. Another effort that came out of the challenges of COVID that we were able to advance with the food policy team was the premise around online access to using SNAP benefits, or sometimes colloquially referred to as food stamps. We found ourselves during COVID-19 in a moment where we were discouraging people from leaving their homes. And in many ways, middle-class folks were able to utilize Instacart or various online apparatuses to order food. And if you had federal benefits, state benefit, federally backed but state issued food benefits, you only could generally utilize those in person. So in many ways, the community members that were most vulnerable to COVID, these are folks that often worked outside the home, were not work from home eligible, relied upon a public transit. They had so many additional exposures to the public than many other folks. And yet, even in this specific instance, we're also blocked from using those benefits remotely. So for the better part of a decade, the food policy team had been working with federal and state partners to advance Maryland's participation in an FDA pilot around expanding online access to SNAP recipients. And as the roles for SNAP across the country exploded in the wake of the economic downturn tied to COVID-19, it was unfortunately an opportune time to just kind of reinitiate that advocacy. And we were successful in getting Maryland to expedite kind of the administrative backend to enable residents, particularly our most vulnerable residents, to utilize their SNAP benefits online. And that's something that is related to the efforts around getting our residents more engaged in the food landscape. We also, in 2018, launched a planning academy. So as you can see, moving from Resiliency Hub, which is kind of like that near-term threat conversation, to kind of the food and planning cohorts, these are more long-term based policy initiatives where we're really working with community members to really enhance their ability to be more effective as they lead their community around challenges around food access, around land use, and community development. Right here, I just wanted to show a few pictures as I discuss some of the points around the Planning Academy. We launched it in 2018. We were really devoted to the cohort model, similar to the Food Equity Advisors, because we really believe that in cities that have experienced the legacies that I touched upon earlier, we really can't address these issues with a series of episodic interventions, you know, a weekend here and a weekend there. We really believe that just as we as professionals benefit from fellowships and other opportunities to engage with colleagues who are tackling some of the same challenges and learning from one another, community leaders do not necessarily get an opportunity to sometimes gain that professional development opportunity for themselves, to learn from others who are also dealing with the same challenges. So it was really gratifying to see the interest. We hoped maybe 60 or 70 people would apply for that first a cohort of 30, and over 330 people applied, which really to me underscored the passion that lies within our nearly 300 communities about how they want to see more progress and they want to see more opportunity for their neighbors, but they need sometimes a little direction and some resources so that they can make the best use of their leadership. So we've done walking tours around areas where we know there's going to be a next phase of development. I know New York City is home to some of the most amazing public markets in our country. And though Baltimore is a far smaller city, we're second to New York City in the number of public markets. And the famed Lexington Market is undergoing some revitalization. And there are communities nearby that have undergone quite a bit of strain. So we want to make sure that members of our planning academy were able to see what was happening, to figure out how they could be involved, to be informed about the RFP process, and most importantly, to know how they can apply some of the things that they've learned to the communities in which they live. Some of the highlights from some of our alums, we're in the midst of our fourth cohort right now, is that we have a young lady who's a spoken word poet. Her name is Lady Breon. She petitioned the state successfully to establish what may be the first Black arts district in the country, state recognized, and it was approved earlier this year along the famed Pennsylvania Avenue corridor, where many well-known jazz artists were either raised or performed, and she learned a lot of what she needed to be successful in this endeavor through her participation in the Planning Academy. But it's not just about commercial corridors, you know. There are many people who come to this academy because they want to see more utilized green space, particularly because we are a city with roughly 26,000 vacant and abandoned properties. These are properties that can be reimagined as not only community gardens, there's a great and growing passion around how urban agriculture can also drive community development opportunities in communities that are hoping to experience a revival. So, you know, it was really, I think, exciting for people to learn from those that have successfully launched community gardens, from those who have successfully, you know, engaged in public-private partnerships around addressing issues of vacant land, and you know, really figuring out how they can add more green amenities that can maybe lead to other commercial amenities coming to their community. And in many ways, the same things that build strong communities, they also build healthier communities. We know that communities that experience high levels of blight, high levels of abandoned properties. University of Michigan did a study about 2 years ago noting that even just walking around communities and living in communities that look this way can elevate your heart rate. It can create stress. And we know that the more green amenities that are properly maintained and are attractive can do the reverse. They can actually reduce stress and anxiety and make a community less attractive to certain types of nuisance behaviors, because busy streets really do make it difficult for those who want to engage in certain types of negative behaviors from feeling that it's safe to do so. So our Planning Academy has been a great success, and we've been sharing this opportunity with other jurisdictions that would like to launch their own. The last initiative that I want to mention, and I mentioned it briefly before, is that we manage the capital improvement, program for the city, which, capital improvements are all about investments in the built environment. And there is a connection between proper investment and and public health, because when you're investing in the built environment, these are the spaces that people spend so much of their life in, or these are the parks or the recreation centers that people either go to because they feel that there's great product offerings and there's great amenities, or they avoid because they don't find them conducive to their needs or their interests. It also is related to public art, monuments, and other things that really make cities vibrant and make them places that people want to be. So we did a preliminary equity analysis a few years ago where we wanted to see where our dollars were going. Unsurprisingly, there was a great emphasis on investments in downtown Baltimore. That's also the home of City Hall. That's the home of many city-owned buildings that we are, tasked with maintaining. So some of that wasn't quite so surprising. We also realized that some investments in things like bridges or the reservoir weren't necessarily a local investment. They were much more of a regional or citywide investment. So we needed to do something a bit deeper. So we partnered with the University of Baltimore, with the Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance, or BINYA, to really look at what are those investments looking like at a more community and neighborhood level. Because again, I said, this is a city of nearly 300 neighborhoods. So when you invest in the reservoir, and we, obviously provide water for the city, but also neighboring Baltimore County, on paper, that might seem like a tremendous investment in West Baltimore. But as a resident of West Baltimore, you may not feel like that investment is as real as it would be if it was an investment in a park or something that was more visible to you. So we did a more drilled down equity analysis where we could see community level investment. So there were some trends. We did see that there were more investments in communities that had a higher representation of white residents. Despite the fact the city is roughly 63% Black, the communities that had more of a plurality of white residents were seeing an increase in capital investments. So we wanted to kind of unpack that. And one of the things we realized was that there was a need for greater data transparency. Our friends at Rec and Parks, they've been pretty fantastic at letting us know where their requested investments are going to be applied, because they have a pretty clear address. You know where the park is, you know where the rec center is. But for certain activities like road improvements, streetscape improvements, paving, other things related to maintenance of homes, sometimes we didn't have those addresses or those local or those specific data points so that we can map out where those investments were going. So we've been working very closely with agencies to improve their data transparency at the point that they're requesting capital dollars, but then also we're trying to work intentionally going backwards as the budget cycles move forward to see where some of those dollars end up going. As you can imagine, particularly because I mentioned, climate change is leading to some really extreme weather phenomenons. You're going to have some budget items that are not expressly mapped out because you don't know where you might have to repair a street or where you're going to have to do something related to the damage related to weather. But you still should, in every given context when it's possible, you should know where your investments are going so that we can be more strategic and more equitable in the outcome. So we actually have brought on an asset manager to help us get a better sense of the condition of buildings.
Stephanie was just in the process of describing to us Baltimore's capital improvement plan,
Right.
and discussing how an analysis of capital investment in Baltimore revealed that the city was spending more money in white neighborhoods than in Black ones, and how this finding has led to an effort toward greater data transparency.
Perfect.
So
Perfect.
those of you who were thrown off Zoom, we apologize for that technical problem, and we welcome you back. We have about just 15 minutes, Stephanie. So what I'd like to do is invite you to complete your presentation and then spend the last few minutes on questions from our remaining participants.
No, perfect. I just wanted to share the last slide, which was just some of the things that I think have been exposed within Baltimore, but not just Baltimore, I think the nation, but particularly in Baltimore, that could be not just challenges, but maybe opportunities for policymakers to think in a more transformative and in a more comprehensive way about addressing these issues. So digital inequity. I mean, there's the same communities that I showed you that were historically redlined, same communities that are challenged around digital access and digital equity. Transportation inequity. We know that, right now, transit is being hurt pretty considerably, right? What can we think about the future of transit in a way that contemplates these types of challenges? Food insecurity. There are people that are food insecure right now that have never been food insecure before. And when you layer that with folks that were already food insecure and then have transportation and digital access challenges, how do we make sure that we don't have increased food insecurity? Vacant lots, could that be an answer, a short-term answer to addressing some of the food insecurity issues? Maybe they could be activated for urban, ag needs. We have a sustainability plan launched in 2009, updated in 2019, and then per the census, the state requires all the major jurisdictions to engage in a master planning process. We want to figure out how our sustainability plan can really be the foundation of the city's master plan, because it looks at not only natural systems, it looks at man-made systems as well. There's an increased demand for outdoor experiences. What does that mean for the future of commerce? What does that mean for the future of just recreation? And for anyone that has a job that requires community and public input, what does socially distant public engagement look like? What does it look like when people have limited access to digital resources? And then lastly, the obvious thing that every city is facing and state are depressed revenues. We're going to have to be creative about how we address some of those challenges in light of the fact that we also have less revenues than we previously had. So those are just some of the things I wanted people to be thinking about as they also prepare to ask questions. And I just want to, again, thank you to the whole team here at the Earth Institute for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. That was a fantastic presentation because it really took us to the streets of Baltimore. And so you did a great job conveying the issues, but also the work that you're doing. And so that I really appreciate that. We already have a couple of questions in online here for you, and I can simply just read them. One is about the first map that you showed, that redlining map. There's a question from Leah who's asking, what has been done about that particular problem in Baltimore?
Actually, you know what Leah's talking about? Leah's talking about a canceled transit project that would have been...
Oh, the Red Line project. Excuse me, I confused it. Right, I confused it.
Yeah,
right, so redlining just was
the
my
red
mind.
line.
Sure. What happened there? Right.
No worry. So Leah, we in the Department of Planning, we were supportive of that. We have staffers that worked on it prior, to even joining our office that were, working on it for the better part of a decade. And for those who may not be familiar with Baltimore's Red Line project, it was a project that would have really meaningfully connected East and West Baltimore through a significant investment in rail. And it would also have expanded access to some of the opportunity in job centers that are just outside of Baltimore City. When you look at the parts of the city that have some of the lowest rates of employment, they also have the highest commute time to the job centers. So some of these things kind of go hand in hand. Our current governor, he, upon his first term, one of the first decisions he made was to cancel the Red Line. That means that the state of Maryland returned nearly $1 billion in federal dollars to build the Red Line and use $700 million of state dollars to largely invest in roads. It's painful for me to share that with all of you personally, but it's mostly painful for Baltimore. So quite frankly, we were probably a very small player in what was largely a plan that was going to be dealing with a lot of state and federal investment. And it really will be dependent upon the next leaders that we see in the White House and in the governor's mansion to see where that project can be revived. Because quite frankly, that type of transportation investment, those are generational investments. And right now we've missed out on the gains of that. So personally, I think we would like to see that conversation revived. And what's really important about lifting this up is that we mentioned that transit has been on the ropes in the wake of COVID. So for example, WMATA, which is the DC Metro essentially, they have seen nearly a 90% decrease in ridership, but even our somewhat, kind of lackluster light rail and bus system in Baltimore, we've only seen a reduction of 60%. And that's because so many of our transit riders, they are frontline workers who work in our really robust healthcare system. So many people that we all rely upon really use it. So we've actually seen some of the most limited declines in ridership compared to some of our, neighboring bigger cities.
Thank you, Stephanie. The next question is about affordable housing. Susan Blaustein is asking whether you partner with the Housing Roundtable and any of the community land trust efforts, including community solar and other such initiatives.
I think this is a really important question. So the short answer is yes. Affordable housing is really one of the things community members want help navigating, attracting, and developing outside of commercial opportunities. These are the things that people want. They want things to do and safe and affordable places to live. So we work as, I think people sometimes forget the Department of Planning, we're not an implementing agency. We basically collaborate with the implementing agency. So for example, the Housing and Community Development Agency, we work with them to really figure out how we can bring some more amenities, particularly to some of the neighborhood impact investment areas. So for example, areas of Park Heights in Northwest Baltimore, home of the Preakness for people who might follow horse racing. That was a community that had a master plan, and some of the momentum around that was disrupted by the 2008 downturn. But now they've been able to build some momentum. So we've been working with community leaders and community organizations like Park Heights Renaissance around affordable housing projects. And I believe there was a groundbreaking on one just yesterday. Also, in terms of the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, that particular advisory board is also staffed by the city's Housing and Community Development Agency. And I, through my day job, sit on the Housing and Community Development's inclusionary housing advisory panel. And we know that 2007 law was pretty toothless. I think it's generated less than 40 affordable units since 2007. So what we're doing right now is we are actually evaluating an RFP to work with consultants to propose an entirely new law, because it really hasn't yielded the affordable units that we want to see in the city. So we definitely work not only with inside of government partners, but we do work with outside partners like some of the ones that you mentioned here. And also there is a consultant that's preparing to work with the community and housing, DHCD around the community land trust system, because again, we have so many vacant and abandoned properties. Unfortunately, many of them are privately owned. So I think sometimes people think that lot assembly would be easier because they presume that the city owns those lots, but there's still opportunities there. So I think if you're looking up that that question, the short answer is yes.
Stephanie, Jenny's asking a question about this this change that you describe in Baltimore. She asks, how did city planning in Baltimore become more open to this sort of community engagement, to equity in general, I would add, and to community participatory planning?
So before the uprising in April of 2015, our food equity team had embarked on, or food policy team rather, had embarked on an equity training because they knew that the work they were doing was in a highly inequitable landscape, and they thought that they could be better prepared to be effective if they had some deeper training around those concepts. And then they shared with the larger agency an opportunity to participate in equity training, because one of the things about urban planning is that many people who are attracted to the field, they love cities. And they may not always work in the city from which they hail, once they enter the professional workforce. So, you may have some very general understandings of the challenges around some of these things like redlining. You may have a very general understanding around some of these challenges around, segregation, but it really, for our staff, it was important to have a Baltimore specific understanding of the work because we've inherited this legacy of inequity and we're tasked with really unplanning things that were intentionally knit together to really create the unfortunate dynamics that we find ourselves in now. So the staff, after the exposure to those trainings, decided to start the equity committee. And then after the uprising of 2015, that only deepened people's commitment because they were saying, this is what inequity coming to the fore looks like. I always tell people, inequity is literally unsustainable. You cannot have a sustainable community, a sustainable city where there are people that seem to hoard opportunity, hoard resources. It's just not, I always tell people, I know everyone's not motivated around equity from like a moral perspective. So I often ask people, don't you want to be surrounded by the fewest desperate people possible? The short answer is generally yes. So some people want to just skip and just move people away and not really heal and address what's fueling the desperation. But for us, we feel a professional charge to really make sure that people feel that this is a city where they can live, thrive, grow, and keep roots. So for our staff, I think people saw it not only from a moral imperative, but also from a professional development lane, because quite frankly, we can't be that effective if people don't feel like their basic needs are met. I mean, think about all the surveys that people are confronted with about how do you feel about, your city parks? How do you feel about your city recreation? If I'm barely able to keep the lights on, I'm barely able, to kind of just meet my basic needs, do I really have time to engage in your inquiry about how you can improve some amenity for me? Like, even though it's like a good thing that we're trying to do as public servants, I think we realize we have to meet people where they are, give them some of the things that they need so that they can actually be a more effective thought partner with us about how we can improve their community. So for us, we feel like we wouldn't be doing our job if we weren't thinking about equity. And to the extent that we hadn't been thinking about equity, we think we were underperforming because we didn't have some of those tools.
Stephanie, we just have a couple of minutes left.
Okay.
I think I'll take the last question here. It's going to be a little wonky. Can you tell me about the equity assessments that you discussed? What is that? How do you do that? What goes into it all in 90 seconds?
I'm so glad you asked that because that's been one of the most difficult things for us to work on, right? So we staff 3 committees: the Planning Commission, the Sustainability Commission, and the Historical and Architectural Preservation Commission. So when we are providing staff reports to these stakeholders to make a decision, we're trying to figure out right now, we actually have a team within the agency trying to figure out how can we embed equity concerns and principles in a very organized way into our staff reports, not necessarily because that information is going to be the linchpin for the decision ultimately, but right now we can't always track patterns of what happens with land and what happens with a certain sets of decisions because we're not necessarily tracking certain types of data in our report with fidelity. It might be embedded in the narrative, but it wouldn't be helpful to you as a researcher to say, you've done, 5 of these easements in the past, 6 months, and they all seem to be happening in this particular part of the city. Why is that happening? Should we be thinking about policies that we either currently have or don't have that could maybe, address that? A short example could be historic preservation has been a big driver of revitalization in our city. We've realized that some parts of the city have historic preservation designations, but very rarely use a tax credit. What's the policy opportunity there for us to get some more geographic, potency for some of our tools? Because we have some good tools, but they're not all being utilized the same way. And we're trying to get to the why about why some of these things aren't. Some of it could be simply marketing. Some of it could be just the market itself is more interested for a variety of reasons in certain parts of the city over others. I mean, despite the fact that we're working so diligently on utilizing an equity lens for the capital budget most specifically, we realized through the Urban Institute's report last year in Baltimore that 90% of the investments in capital are really driven by the private market. So, we know that we can't tell the whole story, but we want to do the part that we have control over to yield more equitable outcomes. But I think for us, it's really about tracking data that we haven't always tracked before and making that information accessible to the public and researchers, and then also using that information to work with communities to have a bit of a game plan.
Thank you. We'll end it here. This was a fantastic presentation. Thank you very much for waking up early with us. And
I have small kids, I'm always up.
yeah, and teaching us so much about
thank you.
equity in Baltimore. Thank you to all who joined us. I apologize for the technical error in the middle. Have a great day, and we hope to reconnect with you, Stephanie, so that we can learn more from you. Thank you very much.
Have a good one.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.